morning. Welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney. I'm the recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not already joined. Membership forms are available on our website at humanists.org. It's humanists, plural, .org. If you are listening for the first time, welcome, and we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events you can find listed on the website, humanists.org. Please feel free to contribute to aid us in continuing to present these forums. You can donate to our organization, again, on the website, humanists.org. So our speaker today is Rob Boston. He's a senior advisor at Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and editor of Church and State, the AU's monthly membership magazine. So I'll let you take it away, Rob. You're already unmuted and ready to go.
Thanks, everyone, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, even if it is by this technological advance that enables us to speak all over the place without actually traveling. What we're finding now at Americans United is that one upside of the recent experience we've all been having with quarantine is that we are able to reach out to folks through Zoom and other avenues and to have folks come to events everywhere. It doesn't involve traveling, so it's a pretty convenient way to do things. What I'm going to do this morning is talk to you a little bit about some history related to separation of church and state, some issues we've been dealing with. If you have any questions, just feel free to hang on to those. When I'm done talking, I'll be happy to address those. First thing I want to say is a quote, actually, from the German philosopher Hegel. And Hegel said, somewhat cynically, I might add, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting quote. It may be a little bit cynical even for me. I think that when we think about separation of church and state, especially, and its role in dealing with religious and philosophical freedom, it is impossible to know and understand where we are now without an appreciation for where we have been. And one of the things that I think it's really important for us to understand as we discuss this issue of religious freedom, separation of church and state, is that our past definitely does inform our present and shape that in many ways. And we really have a history when it comes to church-state separation and separation of religion and government, however you want to phrase it, that it's something to be proud of. We started out, as many of you know, scattered colonies from various European nations along the East Coast, some formed for commercial reasons, others for people who wanted to establish theocratic government. We came from that experience, especially if you look at the situation in Massachusetts and the Bay Colony and the theocratic government there, the intolerant activities that occurred there. We came from that to a nation that has complete religious and philosophical freedom for all, the right to believe or not, as you see fit, guided by conscience, that is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. And that is quite significant. Remember, at the time that the United States was founded, as a separate nation after the Revolution, the idea that church and state could be separated was a very radical idea. A more common experience growing out of European nations was church and state combined. And indeed, there were a lot of people who believed at that time that religion and government could not survive without some kind of mutual prop or dependency upon one another. So to sever that tie, to create that separation, was very much a radical idea, and one that was somewhat untested. But we can see the results of that all around us, with the hundreds, if not thousands, of different religious beliefs, the growing presence of people who have no particular faith, the way people characterize themselves, as atheist, agnostic, humanist, freethinker, a growing segment of our population. All of that speaks well to the ideas and the genius of the founders in creating this church-state separation. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. The founders definitely did not get everything right. We know that they embraced slavery. They supported the subjugation of women. They created a government that pushed power upward to white, wealthy landowners, to the rich. But they also gave us a system that can be changed so that we can go back and we can begin to rectify some of those problems. But more importantly, even though they got some things wrong, they did get some things right. And one of the things they definitely got right was religious freedom. And as I talk to you today, one of the things I want to sort of use as a little bit of a current going through the whole talk is much of what you hear about the origins of the country and the separation of church and state coming from Christian nationalists, the religious right, the politically engaged right-wing evangelicals, that it's all false. They have created a narrative of the Christian nation myth that they promote, that they believe in strongly. But just as they believe in creationism, and that's not scientific, their historical view is inaccurate as well. In fact, I have called it a form of historical creationism that is not backed by the evidence and it is not supported. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have power and it doesn't motivate people. So I think one of the first things that's important for us to do is really look at some of the evidence that debunks the idea of the Christian nation myth, because it is so pervasive. And we hear this coming from highly placed individuals in government and public life today, this idea that we were founded to be a Christian nation. And there are a couple of lines of evidence that debunk that pretty definitively. The first is the text of the Constitution itself. And really, if we think about it, we don't need to go much beyond here. What does our Constitution say? Remember, our Constitution is our governing document. Well, what does it say about Christianity? What does it say about Jesus Christ? What does it say about God? Does it establish a church? No, it does none of those things. The Constitution is a wholly secular document. It contains no references to Christ, no references to Christianity, no references to God. It is not intended to establish any kind of a religious state, just the opposite. In fact, in the original Constitution, as written, there is a provision in Article 6 that states that there will be no religious tests, that is to say, no religious qualifications for federal office. So you don't have to be a Christian to hold federal office, or you don't have to be a Protestant or a Catholic or anything like that. You can have whatever religious or philosophical belief you want and still hold federal office. Well, why would an officially Christian nation have put a provision like that into its constitution? Well, the answer is we were never intended to be an officially Christian nation. Now, as many of you know, when the Constitution was originally written, it did not contain any explicit guarantees of religious freedom, free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, any of those freedoms that we take for granted today and are found in our First Amendment were not part of the original Constitution. They were added about a year or so later when James Madison helped write what we know today as the Bill of Rights. Now, Madison's original proposal was 20 amendments, so it was a really unwieldy kind of a document. That was submitted to Congress. Congress whittled it down 12 amendments, submitted those 12 amendments to the states. What we know today as the First Amendment was actually originally the third. The first two amendments didn't make it past ratification, so the Third Amendment bumped up to the First Amendment. First Amendment begins with an explicit guarantee of religious freedoms. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those are the religion clauses of the First Amendment. 16 words. Imagine encapsulating a fundamental human right in 16 words. Congress did that back then. I think they would find it next to impossible to do that today. So the text of the Constitution does not support the idea of the Christian nation. Nowhere in that document is that in fact stated. And in fact, the text of the Constitution cuts very much in the other way. So that's the first line of evidence. Second line of evidence is, what about the political beliefs of the founders? That the founders believed that it was good to have church and state combined. Well, undoubtedly some did. You know, there were some people back in the day after the Revolution, when the government was being created, that believed in the idea of religion and government being combined, but their views did not carry the day. Instead, the faction that argued for separation of church and state, led primarily by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and some others, were the ones that were victorious. Remember, the founders were keenly aware of the European experience. They were well versed in history. They knew what the combination of religion and government had done to those European nations for hundreds of years. War, violence, conflict, terror, death. They knew about that experience. They did not want that to be created in this country. And in fact, they knew about the experience that had occurred in some of the early colonies. In the United States, when we were still the property of Great Britain, before we were the United States, some colonies did have established churches. As you know, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was theocratic in its Puritan approach. The Carolinas and Virginia had Anglican church established by law. There were other colonies where there were other churches officially established where the law was based on religion. So they knew about the experience of combining religion and government from the European experience and from their own experiences here in this country. And they wanted there to be a different approach. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson authored what is called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, a bill that did two things. Disestablished the Anglican Church in Virginia and gave every person the right to choose their own faith. Now, when Jefferson first proposed that in 1776, he couldn't get it through. But some years later, in 1785, his friend and ally, James Madison, did push it through the Virginia legislature. And that bill is important because it doesn't give any preference to Christianity. When it was being debated in the Virginia legislature, a proposal was put forth to limit its protections to Christians only. In other words, you were free to choose your own religion as long as it was some variety of Christianity. You could choose a Christian church to be your favorite church, the one you would pay taxes to support, but it had to be Christian. Well, Jefferson and Madison knew that that was no good. They wanted complete religious freedom for everybody. And when the bill passed, as Jefferson had written it, giving religious freedom to all and not preference to Christianity, Jefferson rejoiced. And he said some years later in a letter that the bill was written to protect the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. So this is a powerful statement that that particular piece of legislation, which later went on to inspire the First Amendment, was broad and was intended to protect everybody, not just Christians. And we can see lines of other evidence coming from the sort of political history of the nation at that time. James Madison wrote a very powerful document called the Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments in 1785. It's a list of 15 reasons why no one should be forced to support a church against his or her will. It's a broadside against church taxation. A very powerful document, which I recommend you take a look at. You can find it on the internet. Its arguments are just as fresh today as they were back then. We know about Thomas Jefferson's statement in 1802 that the First Amendment erected a wall of separation between church and state. We also know that there were allies in the clerical community, in the religious community, who worked with Jefferson and Madison to create the separation of church and state. John Leland was a Baptist minister, a very conservative, devout man, strongly convinced about the truth of Christianity, but he was an absolute, powerful advocate for separation of religion and state and argued for that all of his life. One of the things that Leland said was the notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. He did not believe that the government should be in the business of telling people what religion, if any, they ought to be involved with. He was a friend and ally to Jefferson, and he worked with him to create religious freedom in Virginia. Leland was from Massachusetts originally. He eventually returned to that state and worked there to end the Puritan establishment in that state as well, and was successful in the year 1833. So we can look at these and we can see that's the political beliefs of the founders. They did not support mingling church and state. What about their religious beliefs? Would they have supported a Christian nation from their religious beliefs? No, they would not. Many of them had religious beliefs that today seem a little bit unusual, a little bit unorthodox, because they were advocates of either Christian rationalism or deism. Both of these systems, Christian rationalism and deism, grew out of the European Enlightenment. Now, the purpose of the Enlightenment was not to attack religion or to tear it down. It simply said that there were other ways of knowing things, other ways of experiencing the world, other ways of learning. For example, there was science, there was reason, there was evidence provided by our senses. The Enlightenment taught that you did not have to automatically default to religion. That had been the experience for hundreds of years in Europe in the Middle Ages. Religion had the answer for everything. That's what people believed. Well, the Enlightenment taught that there were other ways of knowing, and that religion was not necessarily a bad thing, but that it should not be used to control people or to control states. So, religiously, a lot of the founders growing out of the Enlightenment attempted to merge religion with rationalist thought. Jefferson was well known for this. Jefferson believed very strongly in the moral teachings of Jesus, but did not necessarily believe that Jesus was divine or the Son of God, or that he performed miracles. In fact, Jefferson took the New Testament, took a copy of the New Testament, and with a knife, he cut out all the things he did not believe, and he pasted up what was left, and he made his own private devotional. He called this book The Life and Morals of Jesus Christ. Today we know it as the Jefferson Bible. What's interesting is what Jefferson did not include in his Bible. He left out all the stories of Jesus as being divine, all the stories of his miracles. He left out references to the Trinity. He did not believe these things. He admired Jesus' moral teachings, to be sure, but he attempted to merge them with rationalist thought from the Enlightenment. In 1823, Jefferson wrote the following to John Adams. The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the Supreme Being, as his father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva springing from the brain of Jupiter. So you can imagine how a politician today casting the vote of the divinity of Christ would fare. Yet these were the views of Jefferson. Some of the other founders we should consider. George Washington. George Washington believed in what I would call a social utilitarian view of religion. Religion was necessary for public decency, necessary for public morals. But he did not necessarily believe in standard Christian dogma. Most of the ministers of the day who dealt with him referred to him as a deist. While Washington attended services as president, he would often leave before communion was served. So he had his disagreements with Christian doctrine. John Adams was a Unitarian. John Adams did not believe in the Trinity. He considered that to be incomprehensible. And in his personal writings made it clear that he did not accept much of what we would call today traditional Christian dogma. James Madison is probably the most enigmatic of all the founders when it comes to religion, because nobody's really sure what he believed. Unlike some of the other founders, he didn't talk about it. People like Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and some of the others issued letters and discussed religion with their friends, and their views have come down to us. Madison was notoriously tight-lipped about his religious beliefs. As a young man, he had a period of intense religiosity. He even considered becoming a member of the clergy, but it seems to have faded. And he found his calling in government and helping to create the very government that we still have today. Most scholars who have looked at his religious beliefs come away with saying there's not much to know, but some have concluded that he might have been a deist as well. Deists, remember, believes in a God, but more of a God of first cause, a God that set the universe into motion and then took a step back from it. When you read documents like the Declaration of Independence, you'll see references to the deistic God. And some of our founders, like Washington and others, used deistic phrases when speaking of God, calling God the supreme architect of the universe. Phrases like this that sound a little unusual to our ears today, because deism is not necessarily a common religious belief right now. But at the time of the founders, at the time of the Enlightenment, it was in fact a very popular religious system, and the founders were really enamored of it, many of them. So their religious beliefs would not have led them to create an officially Christian nation, because that is not what they personally believed. So that's that line of evidence. Well, what's next? The fourth line of evidence is we can look at what happened in this country after the Constitution was adopted and after the Bill of Rights was adopted. There was a reaction to those things. There were people who were very disappointed that the Constitution did not contain any explicit reference to Christianity, that it did not establish a Christian nation. In fact, there were ministers who attacked the new government from the pulpit. because they were convinced that any government that did not embrace Christianity would collapse, that God would not allow it to survive. And this continued. I mean, these sermons are available. You can still read them today. Some of them were printed and have come down to us with these ministers attacking the Constitution. One of my favorites was a minister in 1811 named Samuel Austin was giving a speech in which he said, "Our Constitution is entirely disconnected from Christianity." He went on to say that this was a capital defect that would inevitably lead to its destruction. So much like the TV preachers of today, this guy back in 1811 was arguing that our failure to embrace Christianity on a national level was going to lead to our destruction. Well, what happened is, after the Civil War, a number of ministers got together and decided that the lack of Christian references in the Constitution was a real problem. They acknowledged that the government was secular, and they didn't like that. They wanted to change it. So they proposed a constitutional amendment to change the preamble to the Constitution, to put in explicit references to Jesus Christ and the Christian religion. Their proposed preamble would have had the government explicitly acknowledge that Jesus was the true ruler of the United States and that our country existed to push forward his will. Now, we know that those changes were never adopted, although they were proposed in Congress, and they were a couple of times even debated. They were never passed. But the fact that they were put forth and that they were introduced is very powerful evidence that the Constitution, as written, did not establish a Christian nation. Because if it had done that, there would not have been a need more than 100 years later to try to change its words. So this proposal was pushed by a group called the National Reform Association. It's a very conservative collection of ministers who wanted this explicit reference to Christianity and Christ added to our Constitution, but they also had other agenda items. They sought to declare Sunday a national day of rest. They also wanted to generally have a more Christian tone to state and local laws. Some of their proposals were actually adopted. Many states did adopt the Sunday laws, for example. So they weren't entirely unsuccessful. But their proposal to change the preamble to the Constitution to make it explicitly reference and embrace Christianity was not successful. It was proposed originally in 1864, voted on in 1874, where it failed in the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was reintroduced in 1882, and then, believe it or not, reintroduced in 1961, 1963, and 1965. So, in the modern era, fairly modern era, this proposal to make us an officially Christian nation was still out there and still being discussed. Now, this part of our history is actually very crucial because it sort of is the actual genesis of the Christian nation myth. People sometimes ask me, well, how did this Christian nation idea get started? We know that our founders wrote a secular constitution. We know that our government was not established to be officially Christian or religious in any way. So where did this idea come from? Well, it actually came from the post-Civil War era. Now, think about what the country must have been like during the post-Civil War era. We've been through this incredibly bloody, divisive civil war. Tens of thousands of people are dead. Property destruction on a vast scale. People literally, set against their neighbors. And of course, the freeing of the slaves and the uncertainty about what was going to happen with enslaved people and how their rights might be protected. And of course, we know there was a colossal failure to do that at that time. So you had this period of great unsettlement, great unrest. When you have periods like that, where things are so unsettled and so uncertain, a certain segment of the population naturally gravitates toward an embrace of extremely conservative forms of religion to answer their fear and their uncertainty. So people begin to gravitate toward the conservative agenda promoted by some of these groups and push for things like Sunday closing laws and the establishment of official forms of Protestantism and Protestant prayers and Bible reading from a Protestant perspective in the public school system that was emerging in that time. People also began advocating for censorship of stage plays, printed material, and this sort of thing. So you had this very conservative religious agenda being embraced by some people as a way of dealing with the uncertainty that was just tearing through the society at that time. And that same principle, that same fear, that same uncertainty is still held by people today in light of some changes in our society. And I think that's what really explains the hold of the Christian myth in the modern era. People sometimes wonder, well, why do so many people still embrace this idea? I mean, you hear it a lot. If you watch television preachers, or if you ever happen to see some of the really powerful ministers that have giant houses of worship, mega churches, they will often preach this idea of the United States being a Christian nation and how we need to get back to that, or argue this sort of thing. And I think the myth feeds a number of smaller myths, I would say, that are very prevalent in especially conservative evangelical communities in this day and age. The first would be the fear of, or the myth of, our national goodness. You know, this myth that a lot of folks on the right wing have, that our nation has always been good and decent and kind, and especially favored by God. So God looks down on us. Of all the countries in the world, we are his most favored. Now, if you stop and think about this for even a minute, on its face, it's ridiculous. The nation got founded, after all, because we came here and by force seized the land of the people who were already living here and slaughtered them, pushed them into reservations. We know about the experience of enslaved people who still were not treated decently and still are not, as recent events have indicated in many cases. So our national goodness, the idea that, well, God loves us so much, we've never done anything wrong. The extreme conservative religious right buys that, but any reading of history, any fair reading of history, shows that it's not the case. The subjugation of women, which was common in our society, the way we had child labor, we tolerated these things. I mean, there have been a lot of times when we have, as a nation, failed. Now, that does not mean that we're a bad nation, or that we're an evil place, only that we must look at our history and embrace the good as well as the bad. Yes, we have done some wonderful things, but we've also had our share of things that are fairly shocking and reprehensible and bad. But that idea that we've always been good and that God loves us and we're his favorite country, that's the first myth that the Christian nation props up. The second myth is the belief that there is a stolen legacy out there. Now, what I mean by that is there are people on the Christian nationalist scene who really believe that we had this great, wonderful thing, Christian nation, an officially Christian state, and then somebody came in and stole it and took it away from us. Now, who took it away from us? It depends. You know, the enemy du jour. Is it feminists? Is it liberals? Is it members of the LGBT community? Is it atheists? I mean, there are different people that they'll pin this on. But their belief is that we had this great Christian nation and it was so wonderful and everything was just great, and then it was taken from us by radicals. But you know what? If you go back and if you look at the experience of people living at the time when that the religious right holds up as being such a great and wonderful period, it was only great and wonderful for white conservative men who had all the power back then. Nobody in their right mind would say they wanted to go back to the 1950s during Jim Crow in the South. No African-American person would want to do that. No woman would want to do that. No gay person would want to do that. The people who yearn for this kind of mythical golden age are the people who had all the power back then and are reluctant to share that power. So this myth of stolen legacy is propped up by the Christian nation stories. The Christian nation myth also shields people from the fear they may have of societal change. You think about how our country has changed in just the past 30 or 40 years. We've been through a lot of different rights movements, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, and now we're even seeing the non-believers rights movement. And most of us will look at these rights movements and say, that's great. We've expanded our freedoms. We're bringing more people into the American experiment. We're doing it the best we can to try to ensure that everybody's rights are protected. But to a certain segment of our population, that's a very scary thing, those rights movements. They're very concerned about them. They are worried about losing their place at the top of the pyramid. They don't want to share any of the power that they had for a long time. So to them, the Christian nation story is a comforting myth that reassures them that even though these rights movements are occurring and changes are occurring, they're always going to be protected from that because they have this belief that our Christian nation will protect them from these forms of social change. The Christian nation story is also a means to political power for some people. It motivates individuals. It encourages them to act in certain ways, encourages them to vote in certain ways, encourages them to do things politically that some extremely conservative politicians want them to do, to join up to certain movements, to advocate for certain ideas. The Christian nation idea that if you would just do this, if you would just vote this way, we can get our Christian nation back, or we can move back to being this Christian nation. That motivates people to do certain things politically. So it is exploited by certain politicians, and certainly we see examples of that right now. Just last week, President Trump, as many of you may have heard, walked 1 block from the White House to stand in front of a church that he had not been invited to visit, where he didn't even stop in the church. He simply stood outside, held up a Bible, had some pictures taken, and left. And of course, in order for him to take this walk, peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. were cleared from the area with chemical irritants and rubber bullets. So there are politicians who are not known for their personal piety who will use Christian symbols and Christian imagery and Christian books to motivate certain segments of their base. That is an old story. And I also think that the Christian nation myth feeds the idea that's very common among the Christian nationalists these days, that they possess, I guess what you might call, a secret knowledge. You know, they know better than everybody else. All history is wrong. What you've been told is wrong, because they've got the real story. And this way, they have strong parallels with the advocates of creationism, where the creationism will stand up there and argue with a straight face that the theory of evolution, backed by the overwhelming majority of science in this country, is wrong, and that a minister or a pastor or a Bible scholar really has the true story of human origins. Well, the Christian nation myth does the same thing. It attempts to argue that all of known history, all the evidence, all the facts, you can just discard all that because we have the real secret knowledge of what happened. And by knowing that too, you can be part of this sort of inside movement of people who really know what's going on. So that's some of the motivating factors of the Christian nation myth. And I think it's important to have that background, some of our real history, some of the understanding of what the Christian nation myth motivates people to do, so that we can understand how we got to the place we are today. Because it's disturbing, frankly, where we are today. The 2016 election was a pivotal election. We knew that because we had a vacancy on the Supreme Court. We had vacancies on the lower courts. We had government policies that were likely to be changed, and indeed they were, because of the outcome of that election. So what we have seen since 2016 is a lot of changes being promoted by this administration through the vehicles of executive orders and regulatory changes. Congress hasn't really passed a lot of legislation that affects the separation of church and state. Congress is divided right now. Democrats holding the House, Republicans holding the Senate. But through executive orders and changes at the regulatory level, the administration has managed to have a very serious impact on questions like, will people have access to birth control under the Affordable Care Act? What will the rights of the Lgbtq community be? Remember, the Trump administration has banned transgender troops in the military, has rolled back the rights of transgender Americans in many ways, and other members of the LGBTQ community. This is an administration that has gone to court to back government's right to display Christian symbols in public spaces. It has repeatedly backed the idea of the government giving taxpayer aid to religious schools and religious institutions. And this, in turn, because the courts have been changing because of appointments under the Trump administration, has empowered groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and other religious right legal groups that go into court to push that agenda forward. And what's really been sort of unusual or disturbing about it has been how much of this has occurred under the watch of a president who was, let's face it, was never really known for being pious or religious. You know, I used to worry at Americans United that we were going to have a real theocrat get in the White House and sort of, move us toward a Handmaid's Tale type scenario. Instead, what we're seeing here is a candidate who obviously is biblically illiterate, has a very checkered personal life, and he is the one advocating for these extreme policies because of his base. The white conservative evangelical vote has been the most steadfast and loyal. About 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, and while some polls show some erosion of that support recently, it's still a very strong constituency for him. And it's one that he knows he needs to keep in his camp if he hopes to be reelected later this year. So he's formed an evangelical advisory board, and it's composed of very conservative evangelical ministers who promote this idea of the Christian nation and promote this idea of government promoting Christianity, conservative Christianity, through its policies. And they have been quiet on any number of scandals that they would have been very quick to attack a Democratic president for. Even the president's demeanor, the tantrums he throws on Twitter and the kind of coarse way that he has spoken in public, religious right groups would have been pouncing on just about any other candidate who said those things. But they excuse him, and they frankly don't care because politically he's giving them so much of what they would like to have. So that's a little bit about where things are. It's a very serious situation. We face a constant erosion of the wall of separation between church and state. We have seen the courts embracing with new decisions all sorts of scenarios that would have really been unthinkable as recently as even 10 or 15 years ago. Not far from where I live in Maryland, there's a giant towering cross in a public park maintained by taxpayer dollars that allegedly is a memorial to the veterans of the First World War. Well, it's a memorial to Christian veterans of the First World War. Cross does not memorialize non-Christians. Yet the Supreme Court has allowed this to stand, arguing that, well, it's been up there a long time. So under their theory, a constitutional violation can't be remedied if it's been around for a long time. And this is the type of thinking that we're seeing. Just a few days ago, the Supreme Court handed down an order in it wasn't a fully briefed case, but it grew out of the coronavirus pandemic, where churches around the country were disobeying orders from governors stating that they had to close because no large gatherings, secular or religious, were allowed. So you couldn't meet for a baseball game, you couldn't meet for a rock concert, you couldn't meet for a poetry recital, and you couldn't meet for a church service. Everybody was treated equally. Well, the churches, some of them, chafed at this and tried to get special rules to allow them to have in-person meetings anyway, even though several outbreaks of the pandemic had been traced to religious gatherings. Well, the Supreme Court did not allow that. But you know what? It was a 5-4 decision. And the only way that we kind of got a good ruling in that case was that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, came over to the side of the liberals and ruled that in the case of a pandemic, when lives are at stake, government does have the power temporarily to curtail all large gatherings, religious and non-religious, at the same time. As long as they do that and treat everybody equally, it's okay. That should have been a 9-0 decision because it's a no-brainer. But it was 5-4. So you can see how precarious things are, even in some of these cases dealing with literal life and limb situations. Well, where would we like things to be? How would we like things to be? I'll take a few minutes to talk about that because that's important. I really do believe that as bad as things are and as alarming as things are, we absolutely need to keep working in defense of separation of church and state because we have the possibility of making changes that may not bear fruit for some years from now, perhaps not even during our lifetime, but we still must do the work because the next generation, the people coming up, the younger folks, deserve to live under freedom, not some type of religious oppression. And I think one of the first things we need to understand is that what we really want here is a full implementation of separation of church and state. And what that means is the government is neutral on matters of theological doctrine. It simply does not have an opinion. Is there one God, 5 gods, 20 gods, and no God? Not the state's business. Right now, we know the government is anything but neutral on those questions. The government very much has an opinion on the existence of God. And for proof of that, you do not need anything more than to reach into your pocket and pull out a dollar bill or a quarter and look at what is stamped on there, and God we trust. So you see the government now taking sides and taking opinions on these things that it should not be able to take. So we want that full implementation of separation of church and state, a government that is neutral on religion, not hostile. That's important. I don't want a government that's hostile on religion. I want a government that's neutral on religion, a government that says, you know what, whether you are a Catholic or a Jew or a Buddhist or a Methodist or a Baptist or an atheist or a free thinker or an agnostic, it doesn't matter. Your standing as a citizen does not hinge on how you worship, where you worship, or if you worship. Everybody's treated the same. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I think we need to understand, or need to push forward the idea that religious organizations should appreciate how good they have it in this country. And they really do have it good. Theirs is a position of privilege. And the reason I say that is because sometimes you run into religious organizations and religious leaders who will say that they're being persecuted. And that's nonsense. Far from being persecuted, they have a position of privilege. Think about it. If a church forms, it is automatically tax exempt by mere dint of its existence. They don't have to file any paperwork. They don't have to do anything. They're automatically tax exempt. Now, if you and I decide that we want to get together and we want to form a group to, say, work on the environment or to push forth racial justice or whatever it might be, if we want tax exemption, we have to apply for it and we have to prove that we deserve it. We have to prove that we're really doing what we say we're going to do. And if there's evidence that we're not, we can either be denied tax exemption or it can be pulled from us. But that is almost impossible for that to happen to a house of worship because the law privileges them. The tax code privileges them. And when laws are passed in this country, routinely, there are exemptions for religious organizations. They do not have to meet the tenets of many laws. Now, sometimes this makes sense. Say an employment law, for example. You wouldn't want a Catholic church to have to hire non-Catholics for their priests. That makes no sense. But other times, it's problematic. What about the janitor who works at the church? Does he or she have any employment protections? What about teachers in Catholic schools or religious schools? There's a whole sort of universe of people who work for organizations that may be church affiliated, but themselves are not ministers. There's a chain of nursing homes run by a group of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor. Most of the people who work in those nursing homes are women. Most of them are low-wage workers. Do they deserve no protection at all simply because this chain of nursing homes is owned by a religious organization? Many of us would say not. Yet the law does provide various exemptions. So churches need to understand that they have a pretty good system in this country right now. The law privileges them. They are not required to report anything about their spending. Sometimes people ask me, how much money does the Catholic Church or the Mormons or the Southern Baptist spend on lobbying every year in Washington? And the answer is, I don't know, because nobody knows. They are not required to tell you. Now, my organization is required. When we lobby, we have to file quarterly reports. We have to be careful we don't spend too much money. If we spend too much money, we can be fined. But that's absolutely not applied to religious organizations at the federal level. Some states do have reporting laws that include houses of worship, but they are a minority. Interestingly, one of the states that does is your own state of California. You might remember when California had the big fight over marriage equality in 2008, it came to light that the Mormon Church had spent $40 million on that ballot initiative. People were shocked. Well, the only reason that came to light is because California is one of a handful of states that requires that type of public reporting. Most states, no one would have ever known that the Mormons spent that much money. That's something that these churches need to do and religious groups need to do. Acknowledge their position of privilege. Stop crying that they're being persecuted. They're not. Next thing they need to do is to realize that their best weapon, their best tool is persuasion and not force. Look, a lot of religious groups, especially the more conservative ones, will talk about how great and how wonderful their religion is and how Jesus has brought them peace and how he just makes their life so wonderful. Okay, great. Well, if it's that good, you should be able to persuade us to adopt it instead of trying to use the raw machinery of the state to force us. Yet more and more, that's what I see force, compulsion, requirement, not persuasion. And what I would like to remind all religious groups is that if you haven't been able to persuade us voluntarily, maybe what you're offering isn't so good. And when I look at especially what the conservative evangelical groups are offering, attacks on our LGBTQ family members, friends, and loved ones, attempts to take away women's access to birth control, patriarchal control, censorship, fear, dividing people, the promotion of conspiracy theories. I think what they're offering actually isn't that good. And that's why more and more people are drifting away from it. And you're seeing the rise of more people saying that they have no particular religion. So having failed to persuade us, they are trying to force us. And that needs to stop, and we need to stand against it. The next thing they need to understand is that they are free to reject modern science if they want, but they can't force the rest of us to go there with them. Now, be clear, I don't recommend rejecting modern science. We can see what happens when people do that. Yet more and more, we have encountered a lot of these folks on the extreme conservative religious right who reject not only evolution, but other scientific principles as well. They reject even any attempt to subject their religious beliefs or their interpretation of the Bible to criticism. Well, censorship is not the answer. One thing we must understand in this country is that all ideas and beliefs are open to critical examination. Religious beliefs don't get some kind of special status simply because they are religious. They can be subjected to the same type of critical examination that a political belief would be, or a social belief, and the demand for some type of evidence for the things that they are claiming. That is not an unreasonable thing. The next point they need to grasp is that there are certain public institutions that belong to all of us, mainly the public school system. And because the public school system is just that, it is public, it cannot become the captive school of any one particular religious faction or belief system. They serve us all. They are not mission fields for evangelical Christians. There can be no official form of prayer in those schools, no Bible reading, no attempt to require young people to take part in religion against their will. Parents are the appropriate individuals to decide what religion, if any, their children will be exposed to, not a public school official, not a teacher. Now, to be clear, there are certain types of religious expression in the public school system that are perfectly legal and fine. Voluntary prayer by students, for example. Voluntary reading of a religious book if a student has free time and wants to do that, not a problem. Meeting in a religious club after school, as long as secular clubs are allowed as well, is okay. Discussing religion objectively in the curriculum, like in history classes, its effect on literature, its effect on art, that's okay. But we do not want to go back to the days when children were compelled to recite prayers or read from the Bible in ways that did not reflect their own religious or philosophical upbringing. Religious groups should also get used to paying for all of their own projects. This is becoming an increasingly difficult problem in the United States. After the coronavirus outbreak, Congress passed a law, and President Trump signed it, that was designed to provide relief. And there were a lot of good things in this legislation. There was a problematic feature. It allowed for paychecks, for the government to pick up the tab for paychecks. Now, most of the time, that's not a problem because people had been fired or laid off and they needed that help. But for the first time in history, it allowed the federal government to pay the salaries of ministers and other religious figures. Now, I understand people are hurting. We've all been hit hard by this pandemic. But we must remember that religious organizations in the United States have historically and traditionally been supported by their members and their supporters, not the taxpayer at large. So to pay a minister's salary with taxpayer money seems to me to be a very serious departure from past practices, yet we are starting to do that for the first time at the federal level, and it's disturbing. We're also seeing increased demands for school vouchers and other types of aid to religious institutions. Betsy DeVos, who's the Secretary of Education, has been promoting this idea very aggressively. Now, 90% of our children attend public schools, 90%. Therefore, I think the funding ought to go there instead of to the 10% who are elsewhere. But we are seeing this constant attempt to divert as much money as possible from public institutions to private, mostly religious ones. And the Supreme Court is due to rule in the case within a matter of weeks, maybe even as early as tomorrow, that for the first time may compel states to offer tax support to private religious schools under certain conditions. It's very shocking. I mean, this was something that 30 years ago would have absolutely been unthinkable. Yet because of changes in the court, here we are. Religious organizations need to follow the law. They need to understand that there are certain religious individuals and organizations need to understand that there are certain laws that apply to everybody. And you don't get an exemption simply because you have a religious objection. Now, houses of worship may qualify for some of these exceptions, but a person who owns a for-profit business should not be able to decide they're not going to serve certain people because of their religious beliefs. We heard these arguments raised during the Jim Crow era. People in the South arguing they weren't going to serve African Americans because the Bible said something or the way they interpreted the Bible, and the courts had no problem striking that down. Now we're seeing the same argument being made applied to the LGBTQ community. People who own businesses, bakers, photographers, many people working in the wedding industry, saying they're not going to serve LGBTQ people simply because of their religious beliefs. Well, some states and some localities have laws that ban discrimination against LGBTQ people, just as they ban it against people on the basis of race or religion or national origin. So to open that door again and allow that type of discrimination, I think it was a serious mistake. And it's absolutely amazing that sometimes you will hear this coming from government officials. I don't know how many of you remember the story of Kim Davis, who was a government county clerk in Kentucky, who refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples even after the Supreme Court had upheld marriage equality as a constitutional right. Certainly the government has no right to discriminate against people in cases like that, and I don't think private entities should as well. Religious organizations need to understand that what they call a sort of civil religion is to many of us problematic and offensive. By civil religion, what I mean are things like I talked about earlier, in God we trust being on the money, under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, the national motto being in God we trust. And you know, these are actually fairly recent developments. They were not part of the Constitution. They were not mandated by the founders. In God we trust first began to appear on coins sporadically in the North during the Civil War, was not codified until the 20th century. Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, that was inserted in the 1950s. The original pledge, as written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, who, by the way, was a minister and a socialist to boot, did not include the phrase under God. In God we trust, this national motto was not adopted until the 1950s again. Our national motto until then had been the unofficial motto, E pluribus unum, never codified, but used as a national motto for a long time. Then replaced with in God we trust. Now think about the 1950s. What made all this stuff happen in the 1950s? What was going on in the 1950s? Well, the epic struggle against godless communism in the Soviet Union. Our desire to differentiate ourselves from that society led us to embrace a number of these civil religion features that are still with us today. And we need, I think, to take a serious look at the value of that. It didn't make sense then, and I think it makes even less sense now as our nation becomes much more pluralistic and many, many more people are shedding the trappings of religious belief. Another thing that the right wing needs to do, the religious right, the Christian nationalists need to do, is understand that secular and secularism are not dirty words. They are not corrosive forces that attack religion, they protect religion. The secular state is the platform upon which religious freedom rests. There are people all over the world who live under religious governments who would very much like to have a secular state. People who live under harsh Islamic theocracies, many of them would love to have a secular state. There are even places where there's still the remnants of an established church, like you see in some European nations, where the church has mainly taken on the symbolic function. And even there you find some clergy arguing that it's time to establish a separation of church and state and move toward true secularism as a feature of government. Secularism is nothing to be ashamed of. It is, in fact, a thing to be embraced and welcomed and championed. It is a positive good for society. Along those lines, Those of us who choose to live in a secular way in our personal lives, the religious right, the Christian nationalists, need to acknowledge the value of that way of living. They could do a better job understanding where we're coming from. Many of the folks that I've talked to in humanism, as I've moved through worlds of humanism, and some of you may know, I served on the board of the American Humanist Association and have been a humanist since I was probably about 17, but didn't realize it at the time until I was introduced to what that term meant some years later. But many of the people I've met, like me, were raised in some kind of a faith. I was raised Roman Catholic. And at a certain point in my life, I came to a juncture where I had a lot of questions and concerns, and things weren't really being answered to my satisfaction, which caused me to investigate and to explore and to look at other avenues and other options. And one of those was humanism. And there's nothing wrong with that type of evaluation and that type of discussion. In fact, it is a uniquely American thing to do, to question your assumptions that maybe you have been raised with, to look for other avenues, other ways. Thomas Jefferson was once asked to explain his religious beliefs, and he replied, "I am a sect unto myself as far as I know." It's okay to be that way too, to have beliefs that don't necessarily fit into anybody's idea or any little clever box. We have the right. Any intellectually serious person, I would submit to you, asks hard questions. Are we here for a purpose? How do we get here? Is there a reason to our lives? What happens when we die? And it's okay to debate and discuss and to argue these things in a free and open society. In fact, that's kind of the whole point of the United States. Yet there are some people, again, on the hard evangelical right or among the Christian nationalists, who sometimes behave as if our very desire to raise those questions is somehow an offense or an attack. It's not. It's merely opening a dialogue. So I want to conclude by just saying that when I lay out an agenda and I talk about where we'd like to be, sometimes people always say, well, how can we get there? What can we do to get there? And just a couple of points along those lines, and I'll wrap up and take any questions you might have. The first point is to always remember the importance of playing the long game. Some of the work we do now will not bear fruit until many years in the future. And some of you, to be frank, may not live to see that happen. I know that's frustrating, but still you do the work. Think about all the great rights movements in history. The women's rights movement. When women first fought for the vote, they didn't get it right away. They ran into really stiff opposition. Well, what did they do? Did they throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I guess we're not going to get the votes. We'll go away. No, they continue to fight. They continue to push. Same with the larger women's rights movement. People fought against that very vociferously. They still do today. And you're aware of that. The defeat of the ERA is a perfect example of that, spearheaded by Phyllis Schlafly, who was a religious right activist. But women continue to fight, continue to push, and certainly have secured many rights that in 1950 were non-existent for them. Think about the civil rights movement. The first people who advocated for that were attacked, shot, hanged, killed, terrorized. Yet they continued to push. And we know, believe me, we know from recent events that even those rights are not secure. But still we speak out. Millions of people across the country gathering yesterday to stand up and say enough to this type of thing. Still we fight. You continue to do these things. You continue to push, even if it seems you're not going to get an immediate payoff. Think about the Lgbtq rights movement and the amazing strides that have been made there over the past 40 years. With now marriage equality, the law of the land, something a lot of people weren't thinking would happen as quickly as it did. Again, we know we have strides to make. We know we have work to do in that area. We know some things are not secure. But we continue that fight because you always have to be laying that groundwork. That is the most important thing. And as far as politics goes, I am a representative of a nonprofit organization, and I know you are too. We do not endorse candidates. We do not tell people how to vote, but absolutely you must be involved. And one of the most important things I think that we all can do right now, and it's not necessarily related to separation of church and state, but it's very important, is to fight voter suppression. Because that is an ongoing thing in many parts of the country. Cumbersome laws that require people to produce all manners of ID and attempts to curb people's ability to vote by mail or to vote in other ways. That's an attempt to squelch the voice of people who often come from poorer or marginalized communities, because those folks are not likely to vote in a way that conservatives think is good. So they attempt to suppress their vote. And there are organizations out there that are fighting to stop that all around the country. And I would urge you to support those organizations, because the right to vote is under attack, believe me. And it's appalling in this day and age that we still have to go back and fight something that we thought we had nailed down many decades ago. Finding out where local candidates stand on these issues, going to forums, questioning people, asking them if they're running for school board, for example, where do you stand on things like school vouchers, the teaching of creationism? What's the role of religion in public education? It's perfectly appropriate, in fact, necessary to ask those questions of people seeking slots on school boards. And you can sort of carry that process up the ladder if you're talking about folks running for state government, state assembly, state senate, or even local government if you have county governments or city governments, wherever you might have. Try to find out where people are on some of these issues, because a lot of times those folks are interested in stepping up the ladder into other types of offices. So you may be dealing with somebody who's in political life for a long time. If you can find out where they're standing on separation of church and state and some of these issues, that is very, very valuable. One of the most important things you can do is not get discouraged, and I know that's difficult these days. I mean, the last couple of months have been just stunning for when you think about what this nation has been through. The coronavirus, the death rate now topping more than 100,000, the riots that have torn apart our cities, but then again, the sense of hope brought by the peaceful demonstrations that have occurred. We've all felt that frustration. We've all felt that anger. And a lot of times, sometimes people just want to throw their hands up and say that they've had enough. But I would urge you not to fall into that trap, because remember this. I know that we're humanists. Humanists don't have a traditional concept of the afterlife. But I would submit to you that there is an afterlife, in a sense. In a sense that when you are gone, people are going to remember you. Some people are going to remember you, and they will occasionally speak of you. That's your afterlife. Well, what do you want them to say about you? Do you want them to say, oh, well, you know, he got discouraged because the political situation wasn't breaking the way he liked, so he disengaged. She was angry about how things shook out, so she turned inwardly. He was afraid of the things were going, so he just decided to kind of stay home and not really get involved anymore. No, you don't want people to say that. You want them to say, you know what? She always stood up and fought for what she believed in. He didn't win every battle, but you always knew where he stood, and he always gave it his best. She was a pioneer. That's what you want people to say when you're gone, during your afterlife. To remember that you always fought and that you stood up for the promise of a freedom that may not be fulfilled until some years into the future, and that you had the privilege of bringing that about. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, you're on.
Okay. Yes, about 1950, I joined the Federation for Reconciliation, and they had, at that time, adopted all of the good precepts that Rob just mentioned. So I've been with that all my life. I'm 90 now, so for 7 years, it's been a good part of my life. Oh, Matt, I do want to mention that I had a good, productive talk with your father, and he agreed that humans didn't start the thing, not the bats. And he didn't quite say it was plausible, but he said the rules did not disavow it. So anyway, that's all for now. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go to Alex and Senna real quick. Except they have to unmute themselves because they muted them.
We are.
There we go.
Yeah, I was going to ask Rob how he felt. We seem to be in a situation where the population is growing more and more secular, more and more skeptical about religion, but the politicians are getting deeper and deeper into this mumbo-jumbo, if you pardon me. Even the left, the people we respect, they tend to invoke God and the Bible in their pronouncements. And still, I see the people being less and less religious. Do you agree with that? Is that what's happening, and how do you see that working itself out?
Yes, that's very interesting. Certainly, there is polling data that shows that the number of people who say they have no religion has spiked very dramatically over the past, say, 15 years or so. Now, we shouldn't make the mistake of assuming that everyone who says they have no religion is humanistic or non-believer. Many of them have a spirituality or a belief, but they just don't align with any of the existing religions. But even still, it's a fairly significant number. And I think what we're really seeing is some people reacting to that, or embracing their religiosity even more aggressively. I do see some interesting trends underway, though. For the first time ever, Congress has a small caucus of members who are avowedly free thinkers. It's a House caucus, and I don't know how many members it has, not too many, but they're very open about their lack of traditional religious belief. And that used to be unheard of, that a politician would openly state that they're not really religious. In fact, the member of Congress who represents my district in Maryland, Jamie Raskin, is a member of this caucus. And there's a representative from California named Jared Huffman, who is also a member. So they're getting a little more vocal. And I think as more politicians step out at the federal level and at the state level and at the local level and announce that they don't have particular religious beliefs, or even that they're humanistic or atheistic, that will empower more people to come out. So it's a slow process, but it's happening.
Thank you.
Anybody else? So looking at the chat, like some of these questions that were asked were kind of in the moment and had context with the talk. So I'm not entirely sure if I can really...
Actually, let me address this one about military chaplains, because that's interesting. Yeah. I talked about my remarks about our concerns about the paycheck program and how that's paying ministers' salaries. The military does pay chaplains, but chaplains have duties are, I would say, different than a church minister. A chaplain is expected to meet the religious needs of lots of different people, maybe not directly, but or facilitate the religious needs of pretty much everybody in the military. So if you're a Wiccan, for example, there have been cases where Wiccans in the military have wanted to meet in a prayer circle for their rituals and ceremonies. Well, the chaplain doesn't have to preside at that if he's a Christian chaplain, but he's expected to help those Wiccans find a place to worship and make sure that they're able to do that unmolested. So a chaplain's job is a little bit different than a traditional minister's. And chaplains, of course, the idea behind chaplains in the military is you got people who are away from their home, can't go to their home church, so some type of accommodation must be made for them. The thing that really bothers me isn't so much military chaplains as it is legislative chaplains. We have chaplains in the House and the Senate who are paid a lot of money to say a prayer every morning, usually before an empty chamber. Some states have paid chaplains, and I just don't think those are necessary. When Washington, D.C. was built, remember, Washington, D.C. was built from scratch as a new federal capital, and for the first few years of its existence, there weren't many buildings there except government buildings, so chaplains were hired to provide for religious needs. But believe me, there's plenty of houses of worship in Washington, D.C. now and the surrounding suburbs. We don't need taxpayer-funded chaplains anymore. The members of Congress who need spiritual guidance can find a church, not a problem, believe me.
Okay. We had a hand up for a minute. Hold on just a minute.
I see Ray.
Yeah, I'm trying to find him. He's not using the hand raise thing, so it's hard to find people when they don't use it. Ray, you're unmuted, and then we got two more people with the hands up afterwards.
Okay, so I've had my hand raised several times, and it keeps going away. So something wrong with the hand raise function in my Zoom. I may need to update my version. Anyway, I've got a question regarding the American Humanist Association. Rob, as a former board member of the AHA, I'd like you to comment on the fact that the AHA is organized as a religious organization, as chaplains and so on. Isn't that hypocritical?
Well, I know that's always been a certain amount of controversy about that, but I think the AHA's decision to do that was a conscious one, with the understanding that that status gives them access to certain places that non-religious people can't go. For example, into prison programs and some other things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely controversial. I know that the Center for Inquiry in near Buffalo, they explicitly state that they are a secular humanist organization. They don't want to be perceived as religious in any way. But in a society that is this religious, having the religious status does provide certain access and benefits that would not be available to a similarly situated secular organization. So the leadership of the AHA, I think many years ago, I don't know the whole history here, but many years ago, decided that they would embrace that kind of status.
Don't you think, though, that those advantages might be outweighed by being able to attract more people to humanism if they didn't see it as just another religious organization?
It's certainly possible, although I don't think many people perceive humanism these days as religious. And I also know there's been a lot of discussion lately about the ability of humanists to provide, I won't say clergy, but to provide counselors for life transition events, christening children, welcoming children into the world, marriages, funerals, especially marriages. Some states have really strange laws about who can perform a marriage ceremony. And again, to have the religious status, it cuts through that a lot easier. The Center for Inquiry is fighting almost like state by state to get the right of secular counselors to perform marriages. And one of the reasons they're running into difficulty is because, frankly, there are prejudicial laws out there, but the religious status pretty much takes care of that.
So you use the term christening. What does that mean to you?
You know, I probably should have just used a welcoming ceremony instead.
Okay. I'm going to move on to Kanita. You're unmuted. Go for it.
Well, I was noting that a lot of the support for religious institution is from the African American community, which would go all the way back to, slavery and basically how the African Americans have not traditionally been treated well by secular society. So they are turning to the afterlife as some place to get the solace that they're not getting from the world as it is. They talking all the way back to the Negro spirituals that were used to help the escaping slaves on their path north. And it seems that the same kinds of things may be being used by the chaplains of the African American mega churches, right? That, God, yes, we're still being treated badly by the man down here, but the man up there will make sure that it's all right when you're done. And I'm wondering if that's a major help in having them keep their hold on those people and their votes.
Quite possibly. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, and I know there are people who have studied professionally the role of that religion has played in the African American community and in other communities. But I do think that there is something to the idea that if you've had a difficult life, the promise of something better on the other side is powerful for a lot of people. And that is often something that you find in poorer communities. I mean, personally, I grew up in a very low-income family, and I noticed among a lot of families that shared that problem that there was oftentimes a strong religiosity. The idea that no matter how hard we had things in this world, that, God was looking out for us and that we would be rewarded in the end. Now, of course, I came to discard those beliefs and reject them. But it's a very powerful belief for a lot of people and very motivating in many ways. So I think that's something that, just a personal belief of mine, one area that I think humanism could do a little bit of a better job is explaining our beliefs about the value of life right now. And the importance of this life being well lived, because it's really the only one we have. That is not satisfying to a certain segment of the population. They want to hear something else. And I think sometimes our arguments to defend that position, to be honest, are a little too intellectual, and when they ought to be maybe a little more emotional. Remember, most people in this country are really swayed by emotion. It's used politically for a reason. It works. So we should be thinking a little bit more about how to get across our beliefs about the importance of living a good life now and not worrying about what may be happening in the afterlife. And look for something that packs a little bit more of an emotional wallop.
Well, those views not only seem intellectual, but they ring hollow. You look at the pictures of the African Americans being, beaten and killed and just treated egregiously. And you say, oh, right, the value of living a good life now. What the hell good is this doing to me, right? So, I can see why people might retreat to a more, a view that of something beautiful on the other side, because there doesn't seem to be anything beautiful on this side.
Right, I can certainly understand that, and I would kind of flip the argument a little bit, though, and I've attended some vigils, my wife and I have attended some vigils recently, and, ministers have been speaking at some of these, and one sort of theme I noticed among a lot of ministers is the belief that, don't worry, God's got this under control, God's going to provide comfort, God's going to provide deliverance, and my first thought is, well, when exactly is that going to happen? Because we've been going through this for quite a long time, and people are still being killed, people are still being shot, and where's the deliverance from God? So yeah, you could make that argument on the other side as well, but certainly yes, I can understand how folks could be very frustrated for those of us who are in more comfortable positions to say, oh well, live your good life, live life to the fullest, when it's extremely difficult to do that, or to even have your basic rights respected. That's why I've been pleased lately to see that humanist organizations are being more aggressive and more overt in their work in areas like this. It isn't, as much as separation of church and state is important to me, obviously I do it professionally, I think humanism is a broad enough movement that it can address a lot of other concerns. Humanists were in the forefront pushing for the rights of women. They were in the forefront of pushing for the rights of the LGBTQ community, the rights of children. They need to be very vocal at this period, speaking out for racial justice as well.
So the humanists need to be showing how we can make life on this side better, to give the people who are saying that only religion can offer any solace, that's no longer, or not necessarily any longer, true.
I think that's right. And actually, I think one of the interesting things that the humanists have been looking at for a long time is what steps can government take to address these problems, and not just through passing anti-discrimination laws, but looking at systemic issues like poverty, lack of access to education, lack of access to health care. We know that there are nations and that there are societies that have provided these things to their people. We see examples of it today. It can be done. We simply lack the will to do it here. The humanists have been pushing for that for a long time, and I think need to continue that as much as possible, because, again, a lot of the issues that folks are facing right now deal with or relate to just a lack of access to some basic things a lot of us take for granted. And that can't continue.
Well, there's sort of a tension in that, say, libertarians will say, you should be free to have or not have a religious stance. But at the same time, they'll say, well, that should mean that you should be free to do your religious thing. But allowing that wiggle room lets them put forth a number of pro-religious things there's sort of a divide and conquer going on.
Yeah, and this may be a controversial statement for some folks, but my belief personally is that if a lot of folks will argue for a very small government or a state that shrinks down to a certain size, and limited government, I mean, you hear that argument. I think that is a recipe for pushing more people into churches, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the societies of Western Europe, prior to World War II, they had much higher degrees of religiosity. But in the post-war era, they rapidly started to secularize to the point now where you travel in Western Europe and you can feel the difference. Those of you who I've been abroad to some cities, and it's amazing culturally and legally how different things feel in those countries. And one of the reasons that I think that they're much more secular is that they provided a strong government-funded social safety net. So if a person got really into trouble, lost his job, couldn't pay for his house anymore, couldn't put food on the table, couldn't care for the children, there's a place to go that's not a house of worship, and you're provided for. In this country, when you get into a situation like that, and we're seeing that right now with people being out of work because of coronavirus and the limited benefits that they get expiring, they're often just left at the mercy of a house of worship. They've got to go to a food bank, shelter, run by a house of worship. And although I respect the work that those groups do, they often have an ulterior motive. They're trying to bring people into their church. And that should not be the case. People should be able to get that help that they need when they've hit rock bottom without having to go begging for it from a church. So the creation of a strong social safety net, I think, actually helps society secularize. Now, I know that some people disagree with that, feel even not the controversial opinion, but there is actually some research that shows that to be the case. So I think it's something worth looking at. If we could build that strong social safety net here, it would leave people with options instead of just going to a church again.
Okay, we got more people with their hands up. So I'm going to move on to Alex and Senna. You're unmuted.
Yes, I have to say, it's wonderful to hear the view so well put. What I wanted to say was, we're talking about the church being. There are people who wouldn't join the humanists because we're a church, even though we're not the trappings of the church. And there are other people who really do sincerely feel that humanism is their religion. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's, I think very positive about the situation right now is that even those of us who have a non-belief system or secular lifestyle have options. If you like the approach of the AHA, which I personally obviously do, I'm on their board, I like the way they express their views. I like the approach that they take. I like the fact that they're actually open to working with religious organizations on certain projects at certain times when that makes sense. That's there for me. There are some people who like a much more combative stance and a much more aggressive stance. And there are organizations that take that stand, and that's available for them. There are some folks who prefer different terms, free thinker, atheist. There are groups that are representing those points of view too. So we have options. The growth in the free thought community, atheist, agnostic, humanist, whatever term you prefer, has been pretty impressive over the last few years. And one thing that's actually, I think, very positive about that too is that even though there are different groups, and in a sense they kind of compete, they come together and they work together when it's necessary that they do so through the Secular Coalition, which some of you may be familiar with, the Secular Coalition for America. I'm on one of their advisory boards, so I do some work with them too. They're bringing together a lot of these organizations for shared joint action on issues, especially in Washington, D.C., raising up a secular voice that had not been heard before and getting access into the halls of Congress and with important leaders. So that's very important too, just giving that voice and allowing the secular voice to be out there alongside the religious voice. Now, obviously, we're dwarfed by the religious groups right now, but this is a start, an important one.
Okay, I have Fran.
Actually, it's Jim.
It's Jim.
Yes, Jim.
I just wanted to applaud Rob for delivering the most articulate, comprehensive, and knowledgeable humanist sermon I've ever heard. I certainly wish we could get the free thinkers to fund a national television channel where he could present these wonderful views, where rationality could have a small effect on the overwhelming ocean of emotionality that we now see on television channels. Thank you, Rob.
I could be like a TV preacher, and I could wave a book around.
Yeah.
I've been reading this book by Catherine Stewart. If any of you have picked this up, called The Power Worshippers. It's about Christian nationalism. So I could wave it around on the TV, like the TV preachers do, right? Yeah. I mean, thank you. I appreciate that. I've been doing this work for 33 years, and Americans United, many of you know, it's a coalition. It's religious people, non-religious people. It's Christians, it's Jews, it's humanists, it's atheists, it's, whatever. But my affinity and sort of I've always had a special outreach to humanism, and I've done a lot of traveling in humanist circles over the years. And it's just been my pleasure to find that support out there and to find so many people who have kept us going over the years, both at the AHA and at Americans United. Humanists are a very important part of Americans United's coalition as well.
Okay, I don't see anybody else with their hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and allow everybody to unmute yourselves so we can go into sort of the general discussion. So please be aware that, this is a general discussion. Anybody can talk, but if two or more people are trying to talk at the same time, we can't hear anything. So just try not to talk over each other. You're good to go.
I wanted to comment when Kenita was talking about why so many blacks are religious. There's a similar argument I heard that back in the era of slavery, if you owned people and sold them and broke up families, you still wanted to be a good person, and you couldn't relate it. If you couldn't relate it to your behavior, you had religion to fall back on. It was by definition what made you a good person, and I think that view is still fairly prevalent. I mean, there are a lot of churches that say good deeds aren't what's going to get you into heaven. I thought it was neat.
Okay, I think.
There was a question in the chat from Greg a while ago. I don't know
You're done?
if he wanted to bring it up, but he was wondering are there still places? Hold on. Or how many states have a religious test to hold public office?
Oh, yeah, I did see that. That's very interesting. Now, I just did some writing about that for Church and State magazine a couple issues back. Eight states do. Now, what they do is they limit, they say non-believers can't hold public office, but they're not enforceable. Religious tests for public office were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in a 1961 case called Torcaso v. Watkins, which actually is from Maryland, where I live. Maryland is one of the 8 states that has the provision that says that you have to believe in God to hold public office. And this fellow, Roy Torcaso, he only wanted to be a notary. I mean, it wasn't like he was trying to run for governor or anything. He wanted to be a notary, but a notary was considered a public official, and he refused to swear this oath that he believed in God. He had to fight this all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won. So the court invalidated those, but 8 states still have the language. I don't have the list at the top of my head, but actually, it was, as I said, I was writing about it in Church and State a couple of months ago, and I did a little list of them. So I'll see if I can find that and put it in the chat box.
Well, he won, but would he win now because the courts changed?
As bad as the courts are now, I still think he would be okay. I mean, that's a pretty egregious violation to say someone can be denied the right to hold a federal or a public office because of their beliefs. Even the conservative Supreme Court, I think, would realize that that's problematic.
One can hope.
Yes. Let's see, I'm trying to find. There we go.
Speaking about considering a notary a public office, I mean, I was a notary and I didn't have hold public office, but one does have to ask people who are signing documents to affirm or swear. They don't have to swear to a higher power than the document information they provided in documents is true.
Right, yeah. Actually, that whole question of oaths is kind of interesting because if you look at the Constitution of the United States, the only oath they talk about is the presidential oath of office. And it gives the president the option to swear or affirm the oath. And that was because back in the day, there were some religious believers, I think mainly Quakers, who would not swear an oath but would affirm an oath. Now you might think, what's the difference? But it meant something to them. I mean, they perceived the difference. So the Constitution, not only, first of all, also it's not a religious oath. If you read the oath of office in the Constitution, it doesn't say, so help me God. That somewhere along the line, that got added and gets tacked on to oaths, but you don't have to swear, so help me God. If you're ever being sworn into public office, you don't have to say that, and also you don't have to swear on a Bible. You can swear on something else, like a law book or a constitution or any book. There was a case recently, I can't remember where this was, but a woman got elected to public office, and she swore in on a copy of a Dr. Seuss book that one of her kids had. Now sometimes people fight that. They're trying to make a big deal out of it, but there's nothing in the Constitution or the laws that requires people to take oaths on Bibles. Now, in court, that can be a problem. We've had cases where people have not wanted to swear on Bibles in court. And sometimes that is, judges will fight that or there will be objections to that. But normally our lawyers can bring the legal system around on that because it's pretty well established that that's not a requirement. It's just tradition, swearing these oaths and on Bibles. It's really tradition, not law.
I've had that problem several times being on juries because they do you all at once, and I usually interrupt and cause a problem.
Well, sometimes for witnesses, not necessarily for juries, but for witnesses, they'll give you an alternative oath that you swear that you'll tell the truth under the pain of civil punishment. In other words, if you lie on the stand, you're going to be found guilty of perjury, which to me would seem to be a more serious fine than possible punishment by God, especially if you don't believe in God. But people through popular culture, people are so used to seeing swearing on the Bible that other types of oaths don't seem legitimate to them.
Yeah.
So it's more of a cultural thing than a legal thing. In the chat box, by the way, I put the list of the 8 states with the language. You can look at those and see if your state is, well, California is definitely not among them, but anywhere else you might have lived is on that list.
It's interesting, in California, witnesses do not say "so help me God," but jurors do.
And in the Pledge of Allegiance, I just keep my mouth shut for that little bit in the middle that they apparently added after the fact. I guess I'm assuming that they stuck that in during the McCarthy era, too.
1950s, yes. I mentioned during my remarks that the Pledge of Allegiance was originally written in 1892 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the voyage of Columbus. And the author of that was Francis Bellamy, who was a minister and a socialist, and it was a secular oath. They put it in there, I think, in 54.
Yeah.
The Knights of Columbus actually had a lot to do with that. They lobbied for that.
I have a question, speaking of thumping Bibles, and I'm asking then an impossible question. I'm asking what was in someone else's head. Does anyone have any insight into what our president was thinking when he walked across the street and held up a Bible in front of a church? What was he trying to say? I don't get it.
Well, I mean, my belief is that he was just trying to send a signal to his evangelical supporters. I mean, it was kind of a strange thing to do. As I said, he hadn't been invited to that church. He didn't meet with anybody there. Now, earlier in the day, there had been a small fire set at that church by a vandal, but it was quickly extinguished and there wasn't a lot of damage done. So, you know, if he wanted to visit the church and express his sympathy or survey the damage or whatever, he could have easily done that. He could have called the minister. He could have made arrangements. He didn't. It was clearly just a photo op. I think they were trying to do a couple things. Number one was that signal to the evangelical base, but also it was a little bit of a message to the people who resonate to a so-called law and order message. Look, the president can leave the White House and he can walk down the street and he can do this thing. And all these protesters who are getting out there, and we're just going to get them out of the way. So it had that message as well, a law and order message.
He also said, "This is a Bible." That was his message.
It was very strange. Someone said, "Is that your Bible?" And he said, "It's a Bible." Right.
It was upside down. Somebody said he was holding it up in a way that looked like product on home shopping.
I think for a while he had it upside down. You know, it's just, I really, throughout my career, have really tried to avoid making comments about what people may believe about religion because I don't know what's in their heart. But sometimes, as the scripture tells us, by their fruits ye shall know them. And I just don't really see any evidence here of a lot of piety on the part of this guy.
I thought the responses from both the mayor and the bishop were marvelous.
Yes, the bishop was very powerful.
Yes.
And made a lot of good statements. And what's really sort of so frustrating about this is that they their script is to just rewrite what happened, even if it's something that you see for your own eyes what occurred there. The tear gas thing was a good example of that. They started arguing they hadn't used tear gas. Well, they used pepper spray. They used a caustic, spray that causes an irritant that caused people to get their eyes watered, it choked them. And whether, some people said it technically was tear gas, others not, but it clearly was designed to cause people harm. So you get caught up in these strange semantic arguments when, in fact, people were forcibly cleared from that area when the vast majority of them were peacefully protesting. It's remarkable to me that this kind of thing can happen in this day and age. Yet here we are. Now, the good news is that the people reacted to that, and yesterday there was a march in D.C. that a lot of people attended. I wasn't there, but I saw the coverage of it, and it was it looked like a very strong crowd and a peaceful crowd. It's very difficult actually to get into Washington right now. Like, I work in D.C. My office is in the middle of the city, and I take the subway. We've been closed since March. And right now, it's not really a good time to be riding the subway, especially if there are sick people and you don't know who's affected and who's not. So a lot of us have just been avoiding the city. But there have been a lot of events. There have been vigils and other events in the suburbs here that my wife and I have attended. And it's just been really powerful to get out with people and stand inside 6 feet and wearing masks. But also understanding that this can't be another one of those situations where we just go to some vigils and then we stop. Must be a constant work. Just like I talked about the constant work on separation of church and state. Other issues too. We've always got to be pushing them forward.
A comment about the church. I think Trump thought he could do that because it's, quote, the Church of Presidents, where a lot of presidents have attended, but he is not marking the door that we know of. And
I mean, a lot of presidents do go to that church. It's known for that. But, you make arrangements first, Yeah. It just was the strangest thing to go there, stand in front of it, not even go in the building, and then walk away back to the bunker. Yeah.
And he says he's just standing there for all the peaceful protesters, and then he has these people separating them like Red Sea with tear gas.
See a lot of stuff going on in Fran and Jim's video. You guys want to say something?
Okay, we're trying to send an email to chat, and I'm having a little difficulty doing it, so I'll let Jim tell you about it.
Well, telling about it is not the same as seeing it. Yeah, I had a representation of President Trump holding up the Bible, and my comment was, if there really was a God, lightning would have struck that Bible. Then, further down, I had found our item in the Guardian that depicted the devout evangelical support of Trump and how they reacted to his presentation. And their comment was he was clad in the full armor of God. And I would really like to send that article, but I'm having trouble with technical deficiencies on my part.
No, or mine. But anyway, the part that's on there is the middle two lines of it, and the top two part.
I don't know whether you.
You can go to the Guardian probably and get it if you're interested.
Why it didn't?
It's beyond me.
Hey guys, Fran or Jim, why don't you email it to me and I'll try to get it on chat if you want to do it that way. I'll look at my email.
Susan is always my savior.
Just email it to me.
Yes, yeah, right now.
You said she's your savior? Is that what you said?
Oh, she got me up a lot of jams on a computer.
She is technically proficient.
Yeah. She knows that I'm
waiting for it.
Along that line, can you see this?
Trump has a Bible.
Yeah, that's the picture I was wanting to say.
Yeah, but see the other one?
No.
Well, I'm sorry you can't see it, but anyway, this one,
Yeah.
And I have above it, Trump has a Bible. This one is me holding up. I mean, this is from the FFRF convention where I was given an award, and I'm holding up a damn it doll in the shape of Trump. And it says, I have a Trump damn it doll. I love we're both in the same position.
Give me the email. Oh, there it is. Just let me see if I can do it. Oh my goodness. Okay. I don't know.
I just want to comment. If others aren't members of Americans United, I would strongly recommend it. I've been a long time member. Really enjoy getting church and state. has a lot of good stuff in it. And if you aren't already members, get on board.
I second that. I look forward to the magazine and Rob's write-ups every month.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dick, I wanted to ask you, was that voodoo doll? And if you try sticking pins?
Just a moment, I'm writing.
There's a link.
I don't know if that's it. I didn't get the whole email, but I got the link in there. You can't. I don't know if you can put a picture in chat.
I don't think so.
That's the problem.
I think all you could do is to put it on your screen and share the screen.
That would work.
Hold on, let me try that just a second. Put it on my screen and share the screen. Just a minute.
Matthew, you have to enable participant screen sharing.
Oh.
Yeah,
they changed stuff so that like it automatically does that now.
I'm blocked.
Okay, now you can. All participants can share. You should be able to share.
Yes, now I can share.
Okay.
Oh, good. Some of those things you can only change at the beginning.
Is this correct,
Susan?
Ben?
Yeah. Here we go.
Yeah.
If there were a God, lightning would have struck the Bible. Oh, yeah.
There's a comment from the Twitch chat that lightning did, in fact, hit the Washington Monument.
Ooh.
It's a sign.
At the bottom is the link to the evangelicals.
Yeah.
If you want to be further enlightened.
That is the link I put in the chat.
Right. That's correct, too.
Yeah, thanks, Susan.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to ask Rob what he thought the best way to fight voter suppression is.
I would say that there are a couple of organizations that are working specifically on that. And although I'd have to do a little research to find the names because off the top of my head, I'm not sure. But they're fighting that in court. But I also think it's going to be really important that in those states where certain processes have been put into place, that people just get on the ground and walk folks through that process and get them whatever documents they need and then get them to the polls. I mean, a lot of this is just old-fashioned voter turnout, and that's something that everybody does. It's bipartisan. Everybody wants to get get folks out to the polls. So there are organizations that are working on that and trying to get that done, and I just think that's extremely important. I mean, for now, if the courts have set a certain bar that you got to meet, well, we don't really have much choice but to meet it and get people what they need so they're able to vote on Election Day.
Do you think it's helpful to just do the postcard writing to people in, for example, North Carolina, or is that kind of a waste of time? Or
probably not. I mean, I don't think it's helpful. I think that in places like that, first of all, they don't really care what people from out of state think. I think the most important thing to do in a place like North Carolina is get people on the ground who know what the laws are, help people meet the laws so they're not disenfranchised, and then help them get to the polls on Election Day. I mean, it's a lot of work, believe me.
That's what I meant. Not talking to the legislators, but writing to actual people.
Yes, yeah. I mean, but they need a resource that they can tap into locally, so that if they're having trouble getting their documents, or they're not sure, what they need in order to vote, or they're not sure if they're registered or whatever they might need, that somebody can get to them and help them and get them through the whole process.
Well, and might you also not need to work on vote by mail initiatives?
Yeah, I think that's important too. I mean, there's a lot of resistance to that coming from conservatives. They've been fighting that in some states as well, especially in a situation like this where we're not sure because of coronavirus where we're going to be in November. A lot of medical professionals have talked about a possible second wave in the fall. And if something like that happens, you could easily see in a situation where people are reluctant to go stand in line in a polling place or the numbers have been reduced because of that. So voting by mail becomes a real possibility. But again, there are a lot of people trying to fight that because that's part of a voter suppression campaign. And you just have to really be watching out for all that because I really think that, people support, some conservatives support voter suppression because that's the only way they can win. It's sad, but that's where they are.
Sure. Stacey Abrams, Fair Fight, is one organization that's working hard to increase the vote.
Absolutely, yes. And she's an example. I mean, she very well might have won that race if it weren't for voter suppression. So she ought to know.
So we're at the end of our time now. So I want to thank our speaker, Rob, for talking to us today. I mean, give them all a round of applause, right?
Yay. Thanks much, Rob.
Thank you.
And last time I saw you was when we were meeting in Palo Alto and you came and played some music.
We had secular music to play. Awesome.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, at some point, maybe we'll be together in person. As much as I like doing the Zoom meetings, I also miss traveling and just getting out and talking to people face to face. So let's look to that at some point in the future. Let's hope that those days will return.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.